Hello, everyone, and welcome back from break to COM 550. We have just a few weeks left in the semester. And do you remember about a week ago? Well, no, I guess it would be a couple of weeks ago now. I told you that I was having a really difficult time coming up with what to teach you, considering that everything I had ever learned and that we know about politics had been changing. We know this because so many unprecedented moments have come to pass, from George Santos being asked, having an ethics investigation and most likely being asked to leave, being expelled from Congress, which would, by the way, make him only one of six in history. And with the former president, Donald Trump, facing so many indictments and yet still running for president, that has created some seriously strange rhetorical exigencies and contingencies. And so the study of politics has changed because the politics have changed. In addition to that, the overall political discourse that we share has changed. And so all of a sudden, the things we used to talk about, the things that used to matter, the things we used to be able to predict, as you know, are no longer there. So I thought that today, since we were supposed to start talking about digital media, that I would first address some of those assumptions that we no longer can make. Some of the things, the theories, the ideas, the models that used to be able to help us predict what would happen in a political campaign in the past, all of a sudden, why don't they matter and what are they? Now, I've mentioned to you before in the past about political ads and the way that we used to evaluate them, and that there were positive and negative ads, and we could tell you that generally speaking, people learn the most from negative ads, but that they didn't like negative ads even though they learned from them the most. So what do we do with that now? How does that translate into, let's say, digital media? Does it translate into digital media? And what are some of the things that we used to know about political speech making, about gender in politics, that have suddenly been flipped on their heads? So this might be a little bit lengthy, or maybe it won't. It just depends on how much I'm going to be able to communicate to you clearly about the things we used to know and why we don't know them now. The only thing I'm not going to be able to provide you with is how we're going to go about studying these things now. I mean, I have some of my own ideas, but we haven't quite gotten there yet in this area of the field. So we're a little bit research light right now when it comes to understanding how political communication works, what doesn't work, what we should be doing, what we should not be doing. And most importantly, we're just going to have to sort of feel our way through this coming election next year in 2024. So it's going to be fascinating. I mean, if nothing else, it's interesting. As I say all the time, the one thing you don't want to hear in politics is the same thing you don't want to hear from your doctor. That's interesting because that means that we have no answers. We only have more questions generally. So where do we start with that? Well, we already know about political ads. We know that most of the time people learn from negative ads, but they say they don't like them. Does this mean that people pay attention to more negative advertising or negative messaging in social media than they do to positive? Well, we know for a fact that people respond more to negative messaging in the public discourse, particularly with X, formerly known as Twitter, on Facebook. The things that generate the most response, the most engagements, are the things that are negative in nature, usually criticizing someone or attacking someone's character. The next thing that we know, or don't know, from that, despite knowing that negative messaging works, we don't know if people learn more from negative messaging than they do from positive messaging. Now, if you asked me about political ads prior to 2016, I could tell you easily that people learned more from negative ads than they did from positive ads, or ads that attack instead of ads that acclaim, right? But the fact of the matter is that we don't have any evidence one way or the other right now on how that plays out in digital media, in social media, in the public discourse as it occurs generally speaking these days, online more than anywhere else. There's a couple of reasons why this might be the case. First of all, our what do they call that? Selective perception. If I could draw you way back to probably COM 115, right? That idea of we have selective perception. We selectively listen. We selectively choose what sources to go to. And this is extremely it's emphasized and it's sort of blown a little bit out of proportion when we start working with digital media. Why? Well, sure, you could pick what cable channel you were going to watch or what news station you liked best, but now you can pick which parts of whose words you want to pay attention to. I don't want to listen to George Santos drag on, but I do want to hear the short clip from his, supposedly from his entire thing that tells me what it is that I need to know. And so I don't want to listen to his whole speech. I just want that little clip. And so I'm going to go find that little clip. And whoever made that little clip, hopefully is a source that I go to regularly that I trust, but let's be fair, is also selective. In other words, I select what news I want to receive and how I want to receive it. Now, that radically changes the way that we might be able to, one, understand negative versus positive messaging. Number two, study negative versus positive messaging. And third, understanding the implications or the answers that we get to those research questions that we ask about what works best. So we're sort of in a gray area when it comes to understanding negative and positive messaging in digital form, normally, in social media, and how that impacts our overall political discourse. And then we can get into understanding the effectiveness of positive and negative messaging. I hope that makes sense to you. So what we used to know about advertising, we can't just take that and apply it to digital messaging. It's a whole different beast, right? It's a different animal, as my dad used to say. In other words, we can't predict how that's going to come out. Another thing that has changed substantially that we can't predict anymore is who the voters and who the non-voters are. What I mean by that is Doppelt and Scheer, way back when, I studied it in 2000, so it's been a while, but they had a great book that described every single type, well, at the time the claim was, every single type of non-voter that there was. There were the unplugs, those people who didn't watch news, didn't pay attention, didn't read the newspaper, didn't obviously look online, didn't care. You had the people who were disenfranchised, who felt like there was no efficacy, like they couldn't make a difference, that there was no point in voting. There were the people who were sort of disgruntled. They just were angry about everything and therefore didn't want to participate. You had the non-voters who say, I don't have enough information and I don't feel qualified to vote. In there, we can probably find a few of those categories and say these people are non-voters, but it's changed substantially. How do I know? Well, let's consider a few things. First of all, we know that the political rhetoric that we listen to regularly when we engage in a political discourse has shifted. It has become more extreme. In other words, what used to be a debate between two perhaps very similar plans or ideas or proposals has now become only a debate if we can put it in the most extreme terms possible. So we no longer really have that mushy middle that we used to talk about. We don't have those people who are more persuadable than others, because people who engage in that type of civic discourse and that type of political discourse who are extreme, the people in the middle tend to get turned off by that, and they say, I don't want to vote for anybody. And so they become disengaged because of the political engagement that they've enjoyed or had at the time. So that's changed substantially, and we don't know exactly what the lay of the land is when it comes to understanding non-voters. But there are some conclusions we can draw. For example, we know that some voters do not vote because we know that some citizens do not vote because they feel disenfranchised. Perhaps the economic gaps, the class gaps that we have mean that they can't get all of the information that other people do. Now, that has always been a problem, right? Like way back when it was who could afford a radio, who could afford television, who could afford color television, who could afford the newspaper subscriptions, who could afford computers, who could afford computers with internet, who could afford the internet, who could afford, in other words, literally money impacted the amount of information people could get. It still does, slightly in a different way, but it still impacts it. So if you have families that are in extreme rural areas or extremely poor who don't have access to the internet right there at home, then the odds of them seeking out information, political information, in order to vote is much lower than people who are from higher classes, economic classes. And it used to be that we could predict that people who were poorer would not vote because they couldn't get to the polls. That's probably still likely. There was a time, though, when we could say that people who have higher education, the more education you have, the more likely you are to vote. And that has actually flipped. There's people now who say, well, I'm educated. I know exactly what it is that we'd be voting on, and that's why I'm not voting. Okay? So the layout of the characters of people who do not vote, who do not get engaged, has changed substantially. In addition, the people who used to say, I can't get that information, I don't know that information, now feel that they have the information that they need in order to vote, but it might be bad information. Or they might be receiving a narrative that says, and hear me out on this, your vote doesn't matter. How do we get to that point? Well, the increase in rhetoric surrounding the idea that our elections are not legitimate forces voter suppression. So think about it. If you believe that all of the votes are rigged, if you believe all elections are rigged, are you going to vote? Well, why would you? Why would you take time out to go and vote if it's already determined anyway? So anytime we hear anybody in any part of the political spectrum saying that votes don't matter, or that the election is fraudulent, or that we cannot trust the voting machines, or we cannot trust poll workers, every time that's repeated, we suppress people who might otherwise have voted, right? So one of the goals of the next year, if we want more people participating, again, I don't care where you are on the political spectrum, in a functioning democracy, even a representative one like the one we have, even in that type of democracy, you want as many people voting as possible. You want as many voices to be heard as possible. When people delegitimize the voting process, that gets suppressed and fewer people will vote. And what that leads to is not quite as strong or healthy of a democracy as you have when people believe in the legitimacy of the vote. All right, I hope that makes sense to you. That is a major shift in our political discourse, is the legitimacy of the vote, the legitimacy of our voting machines, the legitimacy of the poll workers, and whether or not, I don't know, Biden's actually president or not. I mean, I can't believe that discussion is still occurring 3 years into his presidency, but here we are. It is occurring still. And so that questioning of the legitimacy of a vote is what suppresses voters as well. So we have all different types of non-voters, and unfortunately, even as they shift, we still are suppressing voters just in different ways than we used to. So it used to be that we made it hard for people to vote because they couldn't get off work, or because it took too much time, or because they couldn't find a place to put their kids for the half hour it took them to vote, or that they have to stand in line for 3 hours, which, by the way, I'm not even sure I'm dedicated enough to do, right? All of those things suppress votes. Well, now we're adding into that, while we may have solved some of those problems, we're now saying, but the vote is illegitimate. So if the election's illegitimate, why would you do it anyway? So at the times that we're trying to resolve some of the non-voting issues that we have, some of the voter suppression issues that we've had, at the same time, we're creating new ones. And that is part of our political discourse. So the types of non-voters, as well as the types of political advertising that's been done, shifts and changes drastically when we move from traditional newspapers, magazines, radio, television ads, etc., and move into the digital era. So we don't know how to question that yet. We're going to work on it. I guarantee you it's something that people are trying to look into. But think about this for a second. It used to be easy to know, hey, do you watch television? Do you watch news? There's only 3 stations, so you could find them. Or even with cable, there were still, a limited number of stations, right? There was a limited number of audience members. There was a limited impact, or at least an impact we could understand. Now, we don't know what that looks like. At any given moment in time, one message or another may have more views than another. We talk about biased media sources, but yet there are people out there who watch all of the media sources that they can get their hands on. Excuse me. And I keep hiccuping for some reason. Sorry. And so what do we do with that? How do you truly take X, formerly known as Twitter, and understand all of the ideas that are being put out there, the interactions that they have, and their effectiveness? I don't think we have an answer to that just yet, which makes it nearly impossible to study. Another thing that we used to study that we don't really have a way of studying anymore is what's called content analysis of political campaign speeches, for example. Now, it used to be that we could put speeches into very clear categories. There was the stump speech. That's the speech that you give whenever you're running for office. And then there was the surrogate speech, which was a speech that you approved that someone else is delivering for you. So they're speaking on your behalf, right? That happens a lot. It happened a lot. It used to. There was the speech of persuasion to an immediate audience, public speaking. And then there were speeches that, say, for example, in debates on the presidential level or on the state level even, that were shown to the whole freaking country if they wanted to see it. They had access to it. Nowadays, we don't have those kinds of speech sort of environments anymore or demands. Now it's, what did you say on Twitter? What did you mean by that? You're answering press questions a lot more than you're giving speeches. A campaign political stump speech has gone away and is replaced by digital media sending out the messages instead of the campaigner, the person running for office. Speaking, or a third party who is a surrogate speaker for them. In-person political campaign events are far fewer than they used to be because it's something that you can do online. So how does that change things? Well, it's pretty easy to evaluate a speech that's happening in front of you that you can see. But what happens when you get into a Zoom situation? You don't know how many people are in the audience truly. You don't know how many people can respond in that audience, unlike when you have people clapping for you. As a politician, as a speaker, sometimes you need that audience in order to get your message across. How can you read your audience? How can you create immediacy with your audience? Hopefully you remember that word from COM 115 as well. How do you create immediacy with your audience so that they can identify with you if you can't actually be in the same space as they are in? If you're on Zoom, sure, everyone can see you. You can't see everyone else. Sure, we could put up everybody who's in the Zoom room on the computer screen, I don't know, like a couple hundred squares or whatever, so you could see your audience, but everybody has to have their microphones turned off because otherwise no one would be able to hear each other. So going digital, as we say, substantially changes the message, which leads us to a media theorist who you may or may not have heard of by now, named Marshall McLuhan, right? McLuhan said this was back, he died, I want to say in 87, so a long freaking time ago. I think, how old was I? I was 13 that year. And I believe he died in 87. He died before the VCR, a video cassette recorder or player, before that became a household item. Okay. And yet he said probably one of the most important things for those of us who are studying political communication in the digital age now, which is the medium is the message. That's what McLuhan said. And what he meant by that was that whatever medium you are using will dictate what your message can be, who it can reach, what it can do, how it's interpreted. Now, we kind of sort of started to get a handle on television messaging, radio messaging, public speaking messaging, political advertising messaging. We started to get a grasp on that, and then we very quickly moved digital, and then things got really jumbled. And I don't mean that in a negative way, by the way. Just because something is complex does not mean it can't be studied. It just hasn't yet. And I know that sounds probably pretty strange to you because you're like, well, wait a minute. People are studying politics online all the time. True. But it has changed so quickly that keeping up with all of the different media and channels substantially, like exponentially increases the number of variables that you're working with. So what you know from social scientific research, hopefully you remember from COM 209 or 210, hopefully you remember this, that the more variables you have, the less validity you can get, right? The less sure we're going to be of our answer, the lower P number, right? You're not going to have the best kind of study with too many variables. Now, let's consider studying Twitter, political messaging on Twitter. How many variables are we going to have? Well, we can say we're just looking at the message or we're looking at the source, and the medium is self-selecting, whatever comes up on my feed. Well, those are some pretty variables, pardon that expression. Those variables are truly varied. In other words, there's myriad possibilities for how that message is constructed, how that message is received, who's receiving the message, who's constructing the message, right? I mean, I'm pretty sure that Joe Biden is not sitting there with the White House Twitter tweeting. We know that. But when Donald Trump truths, is that how we're calling this? The Truth Social? I don't know what to call them, tweets or truths. When he speaks, we know it's him. He's made that incredibly clear, as did his campaign. Okay, great. We've sorted that part out. But what does that really tell us? Nothing. And so asking who's the audience, who's receiving it, who's getting it, who's responding to it, how are they responding? Again, the variables become multitudinous.